So this morning, I want to talk about another barrier on our path, and one that we probably don't talk about enough, which is cynicism. And this is a pretty common human attitude that can interfere significantly with our progress. And it's a worldview that I'm sad to say for too many years colored how I saw the world. It's a school of thought. I didn't know this till I began to start writing this talk, but cynicism is a school of thought that actually emerged in ancient Greece. But it has a profound impact on how we view humanity, relationships, trust, all important aspects of our path. And at its core, if you sort of boil it down, cynicism is characterized by a deep distrust of human motives and a belief that self-interest is the primary driver of human behavior. And I think cynical people, and this was certainly true in my own life, are typically not happy. They're not content. It's just hard to see the world positively when you're operating through the lens of cynicism. So I want to explore a little bit the key aspects of cynicism, look at its impact, especially on relationships and trust, which is where I think it really rears its ugly head, and then also contrast it and compare it to skepticism, because those two terms often get conflated and they're really not the same. So we'll talk about this morning the role of self-interest, this dichotomy that cynicism creates between cooperation and competition, and then the relevant teachings from the Buddha that I think offer a contrasting perspective to this view. So the bottom line with cynicism is, how can I connect with you meaningfully if I don't trust you? When I see you as indifferent to my concerns or to my needs, because the cynical view of humanity is one of inherent selfishness and moral weakness. Cynics believe that humans are driven primarily by their own desires and will act in ways that benefit themselves, even at the expense of others. And this belief is rooted in the idea that virtue and moral integrity are rare, and that most people will compromise their principles when it serves their interest. So you can see this is not a pretty picture. And cynics often point to examples of corruption, hypocrisy, betrayal, criminal behavior, and so forth as evidence of this flawed nature of humanity. Now, I am not so naive to suggest that these things don't exist. We see them around us all the time. But what I am suggesting is that we have choices about whether to indulge a cynical outlook when it begins to arise or when we bump up against it. Because what I said a moment ago is where cynicism most concerns me is the impact that it has on our relationships, which is significant. And this is because when one adopts a cynical outlook or indulges a cynical outlook, it becomes difficult, if not impossible, to form deep, meaningful connections with others, which are so important to our experience as human beings. Cynics are less likely to trust others, or they assume others are always acting out of self-interest. This lack of trust obviously can create a reluctance to open up emotionally to that person, to share vulnerabilities, to seek support from others. In other words, cynicism creates a barrier to intimacy. And perhaps worst of all, it fosters a sense or an experience of isolation and loneliness as individuals, because we feel we can't really depend on anybody. We can only look out for ourselves. And this is not a way I want to live. I mean, I've been there. I don't want to go back. So that all said, let's just for a moment look at the distinction between cynicism and skepticism. Both certainly involve questioning and doubt, but where skepticism differs is it's a more neutral stance. It seeks evidence and reasons before accepting a claim. Now, I consider myself a skeptic about many things that I can't perceive directly. It's why we don't accept the Buddha's teachings with blind faith that we talked about the other day. We do as the Buddha taught, We try them out, see if they work for us with a healthy skeptical attitude. As skeptics, we may have reservations about aspects of human nature, but we're open to the possibility of goodness, altruism, and other favorable traits. In contrast, cynics have this predetermined negative view. That's the lens with which they view the world. It's a negative view of human motives. They're less likely to be swayed by evidence to the contrary. They'll always come back to that negative view. Whereas skepticism, in my view, can be healthy, encourage critical thinking in the pursuit of truth, as we talked about on Wednesday. Cynicism, on the other hand, I think leads to a more jaded, pessimistic outlook that really colors all aspects of life. It is the lens through which the world is viewed. Now, as I said, this cynical emphasis on self-interest, which is all about the ego, let's be clear about that. It's all about me, has significant implications for the dynamics between cooperation and competition. Cynics believe that individuals will always prioritize their own needs and desires over those of the group, over those of others, making genuine cooperation difficult, if not impossible. They even view altruistic acts as disguised forms of self-interest, such as the desire for social approval, reciprocal favors. In other words, from a cynic's point of view, every interaction with others is by definition transactional. You scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. In a cynical world, competition is the natural state of human interaction, with individuals constantly vying for power, resources, and advantage over others. And we only need to turn on the TV or pick up a newspaper to see how pervasive that view has become and how destructive it is. Because in our modern Western world, this is way too much the case. The good news is the cynical view of human nature is challenged by the Buddha's teachings of compassion and interdependence. As you know, the Buddha taught that there's an inherent interconnectedness of all of us, all beings, and he emphasized the cultivation of compassion, empathy, and selflessness. The whole Buddhist concept of no self challenges the idea of this fixed, independent self that is separate from others, that always has to dominate, win, take advantage of others, exploit all openings, and so forth. Instead, he highlighted this fluid and interdependent nature of existence. And so if we recognize our shared suffering, if we recognize our shared aspirations, Buddhism encourages us to transcend narrow self-interest. Of course, it's going to be there, but not let it be the dominant force in our lives. Instead, we work toward the well-being of all, which is fundamental to this path. And it is what the world desperately needs, in my opinion, right now. Because the Buddha offered an alternative to the cynical worldview. He emphasized the potential for human goodness. He emphasized the transformative power of compassion. Now, this doesn't mean we're naive, babes in the woods, lambs to slaughter, that we just, roll over and everyone walks all over us, all the cynics take advantage of us. But what it means is by practicing mindfulness, self-reflection, loving kindness, we cultivate a more trusting and open-hearted approach to others and to relationships. But here's where we protect ourselves. We also employ wisdom and discernment to differentiate safe from unsafe interactions, trustworthy from untrustworthy interactions, so that others, aren't just taking advantage of us. We're not, as I said, just naive babes in the woods. The Buddha's teachings encourage us to examine our own motives and biases, including self-interest, and develop a more nuanced understanding of human behavior, one which acknowledges both our flaws and that includes our heightened self-interest and our capacity for growth and kindness. Excuse me, another antidote to cynicism is gratitude and cultivating a sense of awe about the beauty around us. Cynics are often lacking in gratitude. They take things for granted. They don't appreciate the beauty around them. They don't appreciate all the gifts in their lives. So we open our sense doors to all the beauty around us, what I call savoring the world. We savor it. We really immerse ourselves in it. It is hard to be cynical when we recognize the beauty around us, when we recognize all the gifts of this life which each of us have been given. Cynicism presents a challenging and pessimistic view of humanity, of relationships, of trust, as I said, by assuming the worst of human motives and prioritizing self interest above all else. Cynicism erodes the foundations of social connection. It erodes the foundations of cooperation. It makes compassion very difficult. And at the end of the day, it increases our suffering. Cynical people suffer. They're miserable. They just think the world is a terrible place. But if we instead engage with skepticism, healthy skepticism, examine our own biases, draw on the wisdom of the Buddha's teachings, we develop a more balanced and compassionate outlook. We recognize our shared humanity. We recognize the potential for growth and goodness both in ourselves and others. We work toward building more authentic, trusting relationships, and we work toward a more harmonious and interconnected world, which is desperately needed, as I said earlier. So that is some thoughts on cynicism this morning.